She walked into that courtroom wearing a faded gray cardigan and shoes held together with hope. Her ex-husband sat
Did you
across
see the
the
look on her
aisle,
face?
laughing. His 28-year-old mistress draped on his arm like a designer
This is just the
accessory.
beginning.
The entire gallery whispered about the pathetic ex-wife who had lost everything. But here is what they did not know. 5 minutes
trusted
before
her.
entering that room, Victoria made a single phone call.
But she knew exactly
and the
what she
words
was
she
doing when
spoke
she stole
would
those
destroy
funds.
every lie
Can't believe
her
it.
husband
Look at
had
this.
ever told.
What is it? The K1.
You see,
it's
Preston
proof.
thought
he couldn't
he married
hide
a
it.
nobody. A quiet accountant he could use, abuse, and throw away like yesterday's trash. He thought wrong. For 16 years, she signed every document he put in front of her. She trusted him with her savings, her career, her children, her entire life. And he used that trust to build an empire. An empire she was about to take back, because buried in a dusty box in her garage was a single piece of paper, a document Preston had forgotten about. A document that proved Victoria owned 51% of everything he claimed was his. They mocked her in court. They called her crazy. They turned her own daughter against her. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated a mother with nothing left to lose. This is the story of how one woman went from being humiliated in divorce court to bringing down a multi-million-dollar fraud. And trust me, the ending will shock you. Lesson and value statement. Before we begin, here is what this story will teach you. Never sign a document without reading it. Document everything when something feels wrong in your marriage. And remember this. The people who dismiss you as nothing are often the ones most afraid of what you might become. This story is for every woman who has ever been told she was worthless, every mother who has fought alone, every wife who trusted the wrong person and paid the price. You are not alone, and your story is not over. Meaning of the story. This is more than entertainment. This is a survival guide disguised as a drama. Victoria's journey shows us that strength is not about never falling. It is about getting back up when everyone expects you to stay down. It proves that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of rising to the surface. And it reminds us that the most powerful weapon against a liar is simply keeping the receipts. The fluorescent light in the courthouse bathroom flickered twice before settling into its harsh, unforgiving glow. Victoria Marshall sat in the last stall, her back pressed against the cold metal partition, staring at the legal document in her trembling hands. Through the thin walls, she could hear laughter, his laughter, Preston's distinctive, confident laugh that she had once found charming and now recognized for what it truly was. The sound of a predator who believed he had already won. They say the truth will set you free. But Victoria had learned something different in the past 3 weeks. The truth does not set you free. First, it drags you through hell. It strips you naked in front of everyone you thought loved you. It makes you watch while the people you trusted cheer for your destruction. And only then, if you survive, does it offer you something resembling freedom. Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady, and walked to the cracked mirror above the sink. The woman staring back at her looked 10 years older than she had 3 weeks ago. Dark circles under her eyes, hair that had not seen a proper styling in days. A gray cardigan that had once been her comfortable weekend sweater and was now apparently her courtroom attire because she could not afford anything better. In exactly 47 minutes, she was going to lose everything. Her home, her daughters, her dignity. At least that was what everyone in that courtroom believed. Victoria reached into her worn leather bag and pulled out a manila folder. She held it against her chest like a shield, because there was something her husband had forgotten. Something she had forgotten too, until 3 weeks ago when her entire world collapsed, and she started digging through the rubble. And it was going to change everything. 3 weeks earlier, Victoria's kitchen had looked exactly like it always did on a Tuesday morning. Cereal boxes lined up on the counter, permission slips waiting to be signed, her twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, eating breakfast with the particular brand of teenage indifference that made every morning feel like a negotiation. Victoria poured coffee into her favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle that Preston had been telling her to throw away for years. She had not thrown it away. Small rebellions, she thought, the only kind she had allowed herself. Emma looked up from her phone. "Mom, I need $40 for the field trip." Victoria's hand paused over her wallet. She knew exactly how much was in there. $12 and some change. The joint account that Preston controlled had been mysteriously difficult to access lately. Every time she tried to withdraw money, there seemed to be a new restriction, a new hold, a new excuse from the bank. "Can you ask your father when you see him this weekend?" Victoria said, keeping her voice light. Emma's expression hardened. "He said to ask you. He says you're hiding money from him." Sophie, the quieter twin, looked up from her own phone. "That's not true, Emma." "How do you know?" Emma shot back. "Dad showed me the lawyer's letter. Mom's been lying about everything." Victoria felt the words like physical blows, but she had learned to absorb them without flinching. She forced a smile that felt like broken glass on her face. "I'll figure something out, sweetheart." The doorbell rang before Emma could respond. Victoria walked to the front door, grateful for the interruption. A man in a polo shirt stood on the porch, holding a thick manila envelope. "Victoria Marshall? Yes. You've been served." He handed her the envelope and walked away without another word. Victoria stood in the doorway, the morning sun suddenly feeling cold on her skin. She opened the envelope, with hands that had started to shake. The documents inside were dense with legal language, but certain phrases jumped out at her like warnings. Petition for full custody, forensic psychological evaluation, mentally unstable, financially irresponsible, immediate vacation of the family residence. Preston was not just asking for a divorce. He was trying to take everything. Her children, her home, her sanity, if the psychological evaluation was any indication. Emma appeared behind her, reading over her shoulder. "What does forensic psychological evaluation mean?" Victoria tried to find words that would not terrify her daughter. "It means your father wants a doctor to say I'm crazy." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice that was almost a whisper, she asked the question that broke Victoria's heart. "Are you?" Victoria had no answer. She stood in her doorway, holding the documents that would dismantle her life, and realized that she could not even convince her own daughter that she was sane. That afternoon, she called the lawyer she had been using for the preliminary divorce filings. David Chen had been recommended by a friend, and his hourly rate of $450 had seemed reasonable for someone with his reputation. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. "Mrs. Marshall," David's voice was professionally distant, "I need to inform you that I can no longer represent you. Your husband's firm has hired mine for a merger consultation, conflict of interest. But the hearing is in 3 weeks." Victoria heard the desperation in her own voice and hated it. "I'm sure you'll find adequate representation. Good luck." The line went dead. Victoria stared at her phone for a long moment. Then she opened her laptop and started searching for other divorce attorneys in Columbus. The first 3 she called were also unavailable due to conflicts of interest. The fourth one was honest enough to tell her what was happening. "Mrs. Marshall," the lawyer said, his voice carrying something that might have been pity, "your husband has retained nearly every reputable family law attorney in Franklin County. It's called conflicting out. It's completely legal, and it's very effective." Victoria ended the call and sat in her silent kitchen. The cereal boxes were still on the counter. The permission slips were still unsigned. But everything had changed. Preston had been planning this for months, maybe years. He had built a cage around her so carefully, so patiently, that she had not even noticed the bars going up. And now she was trapped inside, and everyone she might have asked for help was already on his payroll. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Victoria sat alone in the living room. The house that she had turned into a home over 16 years suddenly felt foreign, hostile. Every piece of furniture, every photograph on the wall, every carefully chosen decoration felt like evidence in a case against her. She thought about the woman she had been before Preston, an accountant with a promising career, independent, confident. She had given all of that up because Preston had asked her to, because he said he needed her support, because she believed that love meant sacrifice. And now she understood what her sacrifice had actually purchased: the privilege of being destroyed by the man she had built. Victoria picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. There had to be someone who could help, someone Preston had not thought to buy off or intimidate. But as she looked at name after name, she realized something terrible. In 16 years of marriage, she had not maintained a single friendship that existed outside of Preston's orbit. Every person she knew was connected to him somehow. His colleagues' wives, parents from the girls' school who had met Preston at fundraisers, neighbors who had been charmed by his easy smile and generous nature. She was completely alone. And in 3 weeks, she would walk into a courtroom with no lawyer, no money, no allies, and no hope. Or so she thought, because Victoria Marshall did not know yet that the thing that would save her was already in her possession. It was sitting in a dusty box in her garage, buried under 16 years of accumulated life, a single document that her husband had asked her to sign without reading, back when he still needed her money to fund his dreams. A document that would change everything, but that discovery was still weeks away. For now, Victoria sat in her silent house, surrounded by the life she was about to lose, and tried to figure out how to survive. The legal aid office was located in a strip mall between a payday loan store and a discount furniture outlet. Victoria sat in the cramped waiting room, surrounded by other people who looked as desperate as she felt. A woman with 2 small children tried to keep them quiet in the corner. An elderly man in an ill-fitting suit stared at the floor. A young mother bounced a baby on her knee while filling out paperwork. These were the people who could not afford justice. Victoria had never imagined she would be one of them. Victoria Marshall, a harried-looking receptionist, called her name. Victoria followed her down a narrow hallway to an office that was smaller than her walk-in closet at home. At least it had been her closet until Preston changed the locks 3 days ago. The desk was buried under stacks of paper. A dead plant sat in the corner. A motivational poster on the wall showed a cat hanging from a branch with the words, "Hang in there," printed below. The poster was coming unstuck at one corner. A man rushed into the office, colliding with the doorframe as he entered. He was in his mid-50s, with a tie that was slightly crooked and a coffee cup that was actively leaking onto his shirt. He did not seem to notice. "Mrs. Marshall, I am so sorry I'm late." The 9:30 custody case ran over. 2 hours over. The judge wanted lunch, and then there was a recess, and then the opposing counsel decided to file a motion that nobody expected. And by the time we got through all of that, he realized he was rambling and stopped himself. "I'm Marcus Webb. I'll be representing you." Victoria looked around the office again, at the outdated law books that probably predated the internet, at the coffee stains on the desk that had become permanent fixtures, at Marcus Webb himself, who seemed like a man who was perpetually running 5 minutes behind schedule. You're from legal aid? She asked. Court appointed, actually. He sat down heavily in his chair, which squeaked in protest. I know what you're thinking. He's the free lawyer. He must be terrible. And honestly, he sighed, and for a moment the frantic energy left his face, replaced by something more human. I haven't won a case in 3 years, but I show up. I care. And sometimes that's more than the expensive guys do. Before Victoria could respond, his phone rang. He silenced it with a sheepish smile. Also, I should mention, my mother is going to call during this meeting. She calls every day at 2 p.m. to make sure I ate lunch. If I don't answer, she drives here. She's done it before. I'm 55 years old. His phone rang again. He silenced it again. She'll call back in exactly 4 minutes. Despite everything, despite the crushing weight of her situation and the desperate circumstances that had brought her to this cramped office, Victoria almost smiled. Marcus spread the documents from her case across his desk. Papers slid off the edges and floated to the floor, but he ignored them. Okay. So here's what we're dealing with. Your husband claims you contributed nothing to the marriage financially. He has statements from your bank account showing $847 in your name. He has testimony lined up from his employees saying you were erratic at company events. He paused, reading something, and his face fell. He has a letter from your own daughter supporting his custody claim. Victoria felt the words hit her like a physical blow. Emma wrote a letter? I'm sorry, I know this is hard to hear. Victoria's voice cracked. I drove that girl to dance practice for 10 years. I sat with her when she had nightmares. I held her hair back when she was sick. She could not finish. The tears came before she could stop them. Marcus did not rush her. He handed her a tissue from a box that was nearly empty and waited while she cried. It was, Victoria realized, the first time anyone had simply let her feel her pain without trying to fix it or dismiss it. When she could speak again, Marcus leaned forward. Mrs. Marshall, Vicky, can I ask you something? Yes, you were an accountant before you got married, right? That's what it says in your background. I was. Preston asked me to stop working when the girls were born. He said he needed me to support his career. And you did the books for his company in the early years? For the first 5 years, until it got too big and they hired a real CFO. Marcus's eyes sharpened. Do you still have any of those records? Anything from that time? Victoria thought about it. Maybe. There are boxes in the garage. Preston never let me throw anything away. He always said, you never know when you might need old documents. Marcus nodded slowly. Find those boxes. Look through everything. Sometimes the thing that saves you is the thing you forgot you had. 1 week later, Victoria returned to Marcus's office with a cardboard box full of old documents. Tax returns from 2008 through 2013, loan applications with her signature, early business plans with her handwriting in the margins. Evidence of the years she had spent building the foundation of Preston's empire. Marcus spread the documents across his desk, his eyes moving quickly from one to the next. This is good. This is really good. You weren't just a housewife. You were a co-founder. We can argue for a much larger share of the assets. For the first time in weeks, Victoria felt something other than despair, a tiny spark of hope. So we can win? She asked. Marcus hesitated. I wouldn't say win, but we might survive. The deposition was held in a conference room at Preston's law firm. The room was designed to intimidate, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a table that could seat 20. Preston sat at one end with his attorney, Donovan Steele, a man whose reputation for destroying opposing parties had earned him the nickname the Butcher. Victoria sat at the other end with Marcus. Their side of the table felt very small. Mrs. Marshall, Donovan's voice was smooth, practiced, and entirely without warmth. Isn't it true that you haven't held a paying job in 16 years? I worked for my husband's company without pay, Victoria began. Yes or no, Mrs. Marshall? Victoria's shoulders slumped slightly. No, I haven't had a paying job. And isn't it true that your husband funded 100% of the household expenses? Marcus objected, but the objection was overruled. The deposition continued for 3 hours. Every question was designed to make Victoria look like a parasite who had contributed nothing to her marriage. Every answer, no matter how she phrased it, seemed to confirm Preston's narrative. Then Donovan asked a question that made Victoria's blood run cold. Mrs. Marshall, can you explain why you withdrew $15,000 from the joint savings account 6 months ago without your husband's knowledge? Victoria froze. Her mind raced through possible answers, but none of them were good. It was an emergency. What kind of emergency? Victoria looked at Preston. He was smiling. He already knew what she had done with the money, and he was going to make her say it out loud. Personal, she finally said. Your husband believes you were hiding money for the divorce. Were you? No. I wasn't planning a divorce. Marcus jumped in. My client doesn't have to answer that. But the damage was done. The implication hung in the air like smoke. After the deposition, in the elevator going down, Marcus turned to Victoria. What was the $15,000 for, Vicky? I can't help you if you keep secrets from me. Victoria leaned against the elevator wall. The fluorescent light made her look even more exhausted than she felt. It was for Sophie. Your daughter? She was being bullied at school. Online mostly, but it bled into everything. It got bad. Really bad. Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. She started hurting herself. I found her in the bathroom with... She couldn't finish. I checked her into a treatment facility for 2 weeks, a private one, so it wouldn't be on the insurance records. So Preston wouldn't find out and use it against her later. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Oh, Vicky. I was protecting my daughter, and now they're going to use it to take her away from me. The elevator doors opened, but neither of them moved. Listen to me, Marcus said, his voice firm but kind. You did what any mother would do. You protected your child. That's not weakness. That's not instability. That's love. Don't you dare apologize for it. Victoria looked at this rumpled, overworked lawyer who had not won a case in 3 years, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt seen. Thank you, she whispered. Marcus nodded. Now let's go find something in those boxes that will help us fight back. The courtroom was smaller than Victoria had imagined. In movies, courtrooms were always grand, imposing spaces with high ceilings and polished wood. The Franklin County Court of Common Pleas was none of those things. It was a functional room with fluorescent lighting and plastic chairs and a judge's bench that looked like it had been ordered from a government surplus catalog. Victoria sat at the defendant's table in her gray cardigan. Marcus sat beside her, organizing papers that kept sliding out of his hands. Across the aisle, Preston looked like he had stepped out of a magazine. Navy suit, silk tie, perfect hair. His attorney, Donovan Steele, sat beside him, radiating the quiet confidence of a man who had never lost a battle. The gallery behind them was filled with Preston's supporters, business associates, golf buddies, people who had benefited from his success and had every reason to want Victoria destroyed. Victoria had no one. Her sister Denise had wanted to come, but she was working a double shift at the hospital. Marcus's mother Caroline had offered, but Victoria had told her to stay home. She had never felt more alone in her life. Judge Patricia Thornton entered the courtroom. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back severely, and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her reputation preceded her. She was known as the Hammer, and she was notorious for favoring the primary breadwinner in divorce cases. Victoria's heart sank a little further. The first day of testimony was everything Victoria had feared and worse. Karen Miller took the stand first. Karen had been Victoria's best friend for 12 years. They had met at a Mommy and Me class when the girls were toddlers, and they had been inseparable ever since. Coffee dates, shopping trips, long phone conversations about nothing and everything. Karen would not meet Victoria's eyes as she was sworn in. "Mrs. Miller," Donovan Steele began, "how long have you known the defendant?" 12 years. "And in that time, did you ever observe behavior that concerned you?" Karen's hands twisted in her lap. Sometimes Vicky would forget to pick up the girls from school. She'd drink wine in the afternoon. She said things about Preston that worried me. What kinds of things? Karen finally looked at Victoria. Her eyes were wet with tears. She once said she wanted to destroy him. Victoria felt the words like a knife in her chest. She had said that. Once. After Preston had forgotten their anniversary for the 3rd year in a row and then blamed her for not reminding him. It had been a moment of frustration, spoken to her closest friend in confidence. And now it was being used to prove she was unstable. After Karen stepped down, she passed Victoria's table on her way out. Victoria grabbed her arm. "Karen, why?" Karen's whisper was barely audible. "He offered to pay off my credit cards. I'm $40,000 in debt, Vicky. I'm about to lose my house. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She pulled away and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. The second witness was worse. Emma Marshall took the stand, and Victoria felt her heart stop beating. Her daughter looked older than 16 in her serious navy dress. Someone had done her hair and makeup. Probably Brittany, Preston's girlfriend. Emma sat in the witness chair with her hands folded, looking like a young woman instead of the little girl Victoria still saw when she looked at her. "Miss Marshall," Donovan said gently, "can you tell the court about your relationship with your mother?" Emma's voice was steady, rehearsed. "My mom is..." She tries, but Dad is right. She forgets things. She cries a lot. She doesn't understand what I need. Can you give us an example?" Emma nodded. "Last year, she forgot my dance recital. She said she'd be there, but she never showed up. Dad came. Dad always comes to my things. He actually listens to me. He takes me places. He's there for me." Victoria wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and tell the court that she had missed that recital because she was at the hospital with Sophie, who had collapsed at school from anxiety. She wanted to explain that she had called Preston to cover for her, and he had agreed, and then he had apparently used her absence to poison Emma against her. But she could not say any of that without revealing Sophie's struggles, without giving Preston more ammunition. She sat in silence while the daughter testified against her, and she felt something inside her break. Marcus put his hand on her arm. "Steady," he whispered. "We'll get our turn." But their turn never seemed to come. The third blow came from Preston's financial team. Donovan presented bank statements, transaction records, and a forensic accountant's report that painted a picture of systematic financial deception. According to the documents, Victoria had been secretly transferring funds into hidden accounts for years. Victoria stared at the evidence on the screen. She had never seen these accounts. She had never made these transfers. Someone had fabricated an entire paper trail to make her look like a thief. "Your Honor," Donovan said, "the evidence is clear. Mrs. Marshall has been systematically embezzling from the marital estate in preparation for this divorce. We request an immediate freeze on all her assets pending criminal investigation." Victoria stood up before Marcus could stop her. "Those aren't mine. I've never seen those accounts. Mrs. Marshall, sit down." Judge Thornton's voice was ice. "Someone set me up. He's lying. One more outburst, and you'll be held in contempt." Victoria sat down, her whole body shaking. Marcus looked defeated beside her. In the span of one morning, Victoria's best friend had betrayed her. Her daughter had testified against her, and her husband had manufactured evidence to make her look like a criminal. She had walked into this courtroom with a small hope that justice might prevail. She walked out knowing that hope had been naive. That night, Victoria sat in her car in the driveway of the house she was no longer allowed to enter. The locks had been changed. Her daughters were inside, but she was not permitted to see them until the custody arrangement was formalized. She stared at the windows of the home she had made. Sophie's bedroom light was on. Victoria imagined her daughter, sitting alone, wondering where her mother was, why everything had fallen apart. Her phone buzzed, a text from Sophie. "Mom, I'm sorry about Emma. I'm sorry about everything. Please don't give up." Victoria read the message 3 times. At least one of her daughters still believed in her. Another message appeared, this one from an unknown number. "Check your old tax files. The 2009 Schedule K1. He made a mistake. A friend. Victoria stared at the cryptic message. She did not recognize the number. She had no idea who might have sent it or why, but she had nothing left to lose. At 2 in the morning, Victoria was in her sister's garage, digging through the boxes of documents she had retrieved from her own home before Preston locked her out. Denise sat on an overturned bucket, holding a flashlight and a cup of coffee. "You know this is crazy, right?" Denise said. "Everything is crazy. What are we looking for?" "Something from 2009. A tax document. A K1. Denise pulled a box toward her and started sorting through papers. "Oh my God, is this your wedding album?" Victoria looked up. "Don't?" But Denise was already flipping through the pages. "Look at his hair! He had hair! And that mustache!" Victoria almost smiled despite herself. He thought he looked like Tom Selleck. He looked like a creepy youth pastor. They both laughed. It was the first real laugh Victoria had experienced in weeks. It felt foreign in her chest, like a language she had forgotten how to speak. Then Victoria found it. A Schedule K1 from 2009. A partnership income document that she had signed without reading, back when she trusted Preston completely. She stared at the numbers. Then she read them again. "This shows me as a 51% owner of Marshall Logistics." Denise looked up. "What?" Victoria's hands were shaking. "I don't remember this. I don't remember signing this." But there it was. Her signature. Her name listed as the majority partner. A document filed with the IRS and never amended. She remembered now. 2009. The twins were just toddlers. Preston had been working 18-hour days to get the company off the ground. He had come home one night with a stack of papers. "It's just a tax thing, babe. Sign here so we can get the deduction. I already signed." And she had signed, without reading, because she loved him, because she trusted him, because she never imagined he would use that trust to destroy her. "So you own the company?" Denise asked. Victoria looked at her sister. "According to this, I own the majority of the company." And he never updated it. It's still on file with the IRS. For the first time since this nightmare began, Victoria felt something other than despair. She felt possibility. Marcus Webb had not been this excited about a case in years. He spread the K1 document across his desk like a treasurer map, his eyes bright behind his smudged glasses. "This is incredible. If this is legitimate, you're not just entitled to alimony. You're entitled to controlling interest in a multi-million-dollar company." Victoria sat across from him, afraid to hope. "Can we use it? We need to verify it first. Get certified copies from the IRS. Make sure there weren't amendments filed. It'll take some time." "How long?" Marcus hesitated. "I can rush it. Maybe 2 weeks?" "The custody hearing continues in 3 days." His face fell. "I know." Victoria walked out of Marcus's office into the gray afternoon. For a brief moment in that garage, surrounded by dusty boxes and old memories, she had felt something like hope. Now that hope was fading again. 2 weeks. She did not have 2 weeks. In 3 days, she could lose her daughters forever. She drove to her sister's house, where she had been staying since Preston locked her out. The guest room was small, with a twin bed and a dresser that Denise had bought at a yard sale years ago. It was a far cry from the master suite she had shared with Preston, but it was safe. It was hers. Victoria lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She thought about everything she had lost: her home, her reputation, her daughter Emma, who had looked at her from the witness stand like she was a stranger. She thought about Sophie, who was still on her side, Sophie, who had sent that text message telling her not to give up, Sophie, who deserved a mother who could fight for her. Victoria sat up. She was not going to wait 2 weeks. She was going to find another way. The next morning, Victoria called Marcus with an idea. The anonymous text mentioned the K1 specifically. Someone out there knows what Preston did. Someone who might be willing to help us. Marcus was skeptical. Who would know about a tax document from 15 years ago? Someone who was there. Someone who worked for Preston back then. An accountant? A lawyer? A secretary? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Preston's secretary from those early years. What was her name? Victoria thought back. Margot. Margot Price. She was with him for 15 years. She knew everything about that company. Do you know how to reach her? I can find out. It took Victoria 3 hours to track down Margot Price. The woman had been let go from Marshall Logistics 6 months ago, after 15 years of loyal service. 2 weeks' notice, no explanation, no reference letter. They met at a coffee shop on the outskirts of Columbus. Margot was in her mid-50s, with gray-streaked hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. I can't help you, Margot said before Victoria even sat down. I signed an NDA, $50,000 severance if I keep quiet. Victoria sat down anyway. I'm not asking you to violate your NDA. I just want to understand what happened. Margot wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. What happened is that I gave that man 15 years of my life. I covered for his mistakes. I rescheduled his lies. I made sure his dirty laundry never saw the light of day. She looked up at Victoria, and then one day he called me into his office and said my services were no longer required. No warning. No thank you. Just a severance check and a legal document that said I could never talk about what I knew. Victoria felt a surge of recognition. He threw you away, too. Margot nodded slowly. He called me the help once in front of the whole office, after 15 years. They sat in silence for a moment. I can't offer you money, Victoria said. I don't have any. I can't promise you protection. I can barely protect myself. But I can tell you that what he did to you, what he did to me, what he's doing to our daughters, someone has to stop him. Margot stared at her coffee for a long time. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive, emails, calendar invites, financial documents he thought he deleted. I made copies before I left. Call it an insurance policy. Victoria took the drive. Her hands were trembling. This could get you in trouble. Margot smiled grimly. I'm a 50-year-old woman who got fired after 15 years with no warning. I'm already in trouble. Might as well make it count. Victoria drove back to Marcus's office with the USB drive feeling like a live grenade in her pocket. This was it. This was the ammunition they needed. But when she pulled into the parking lot, she saw a familiar car, a black Mercedes SUV with the personalized license plate, Presto. Preston was leaning against the vehicle, waiting for her. Hello, Vicky. He smiled the smile she had once loved, the smile she now recognized as a weapon. What are you doing here? I wanted to talk, privately, before this goes any further. Victoria's hand closed around the USB drive in her pocket. I have nothing to say to you. Preston pushed off from the car and walked toward her. You found the K1, didn't you? Karen told me you were digging through boxes in the garage. Very clever, Vicky. I always underestimated how clever you could be. Then you know I own more than half your company. Preston laughed. It was not a nice laugh. You own 51% of a company that, as of this morning, has zero assets. I spent the last week transferring everything to a new corporation. Marshall Logistics is an empty shell. And you, my dear, are the majority owner of nothing. Victoria felt the hope she had been nurturing collapse like a house of cards. But here's the thing. Preston's voice was friendly, reasonable. I'm a nice guy. I don't want this to get ugly. Drop the custody fight. Walk away. Take whatever's in that K1 company, which is nothing, and start over somewhere else. And if I don't, his smile did not waver. Then I'll press charges for the embezzlement my lawyers discovered. You'll spend the next 5 years fighting criminal charges instead of seeing your daughters. I didn't embezzle anything, Preston shrugged. Doesn't matter what's true. Matters what a jury believes. And right now, Vicky, nobody believes you about anything. He walked back to his car. Think about it. You have until the hearing on Friday. Victoria watched him drive away. The USB drive was still in her pocket. The K1 was still in Marcus's office, but none of it mattered if Preston had already moved the assets. She had found the weapon to defeat him, and he had already made it worthless. She walked into Marcus's office and sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk. He knows about the K1, she said. He's already moved everything. Marcus's face fell. All of it? Every asset, every account. The company is an empty shell. They sat in silence for a long moment. So it's over, Victoria said. Marcus stared at his desk, at the scattered papers and cold coffee cups, and the weight of another case he was about to lose. I don't know how to fight this, he finally said. I'm sorry, Vicky. I told you I wasn't a good lawyer. Victoria looked at this man who had tried so hard to help her. This man who showed up every day to a job that defeated him because he believed it mattered. Marcus, she said, you're the only person who's actually tried to help me. That means something. His phone rang. He glanced at the screen. That's my mother. You should answer. He picked up the phone. Yes, Mom. I ate lunch. No, I'm with a client. Mom, I can't really... He paused. His expression changed. What do you mean you know about asset transfers? He listened for another moment, then slowly put the phone on speaker. Is this the Victoria case? A woman's voice filled the room. Sharp, clear, and unexpectedly commanding. The one you can't stop talking about? Mom, I worked for Judge Morrison for 40 years, honey. I've seen every dirty trick in the book. If this Preston character moved assets right before a divorce proceeding, that's called fraudulent conveyance. And here's the beautiful thing. It's reversible. But only if you can prove the timeline and intent. Victoria leaned forward. How do we prove that? Get me every document you have, sweetheart, and call your husband's secretary. Secretaries know everything, and they remember every slight. Victoria touched the USB drive in her pocket. I already have her help. There was a smile in Carolyn Webb's voice. Then let's get to work. Carolyn Webb was 78 years old, and she was terrifying. She arrived at Marcus's office the next morning with a rolling briefcase, a magnifying glass, and a look in her eye that suggested she had been waiting 40 years for exactly this moment. She spread the documents across Marcus's desk with military precision. Tax returns here. Corporate filings here. Bank statements here. She turned to Victoria. Now, walk me through everything that man did from the beginning. For the next 6 hours, Caroline conducted the most thorough investigation of Victoria's marriage that had ever been attempted. She asked questions Victoria had never thought to ask. She found connections Victoria had never noticed. She built a timeline that revealed the true architecture of Preston's betrayal. He's been planning this for at least 5 years, Caroline said finally, removing her glasses to rub her eyes. The asset transfers started in 2019, small ones at first, but they accelerated dramatically about 18 months ago. What happened 18 months ago? Victoria asked. Caroline looked at her with something like sympathy. That's when he met Miss Cole, Brittany, the mistress, the woman who would replace Victoria in every way. Victoria felt sick. But here's the interesting thing. Caroline shuffled through the papers. The final transfer, the one that emptied Marshall Logistics, was executed 11 days ago, 3 days after he filed for divorce. Why is that interesting? Marcus asked. Because in Ohio, any asset transfer made within 90 days of a divorce filing can be challenged as fraudulent conveyance. If we can prove he moved those assets specifically to deprive his wife of her fair share, the court can reverse the transfers. Can we prove that? Victoria asked. Caroline smiled. That depends on what's on that USB drive. The contents of Margot's USB drive were a revelation. Emails between Preston and his lawyer discussing the best timing for asset transfers. Calendar entries showing meetings with offshore accountants. Draft documents for the new corporation that explicitly mentioned Victoria's claims will be nullified. But the most damaging piece of evidence was a video. Margot had not just copied documents. She had also saved recordings from the office security cameras. Recordings that showed Preston in his office, laughing with Brittany Cole about how easy it had been to fool his wife. She actually thinks she's going to get half. Preston's recorded voice filled Marcus's small office. By the time we're done, she'll be lucky to get bus fare. Brittany's laugh was high and cruel. Does she even know about the K1? She signed it without reading, just like everything else. Preston shook his head. 16 years of marriage, and she never once questioned anything I put in front of her. Victoria watched the video with a strange sense of detachment. There was her husband, the father of her children, the man she had trusted with everything. And he was laughing at her naivety. This is good, Caroline said, making notes. This is very good. Will it be enough? Victoria asked. Caroline looked up at her. Sweetheart, in 40 years of legal work, I've never seen a case this well documented. The only question is whether the judge will allow the evidence. And if she doesn't, then we find another way. There's always another way. That night, Victoria received a visitor at her sister's house. Sophie stood at the door, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her eyes red from crying. Mom, she said, and then she was in Victoria's arms, sobbing. They sat on the edge of the guest bed for a long time, mother and daughter, holding each other. I'm sorry, Sophie whispered. I'm sorry I couldn't make Emma understand. Victoria stroked her daughter's hair. This isn't your fault, baby. None of this is your fault. Sophie pulled back, wiping her eyes. Mom, I need to show you something. She opened her laptop. The screen filled with screenshots, recordings, text messages. Dad didn't know I had my phone at his apartment. Sophie's voice was steady now, determined. I recorded him and Brittany talking about you, about the plan. Victoria stared at the evidence her daughter had gathered. Conversations about manipulating Emma. Discussions about the fabricated bank accounts. A moment where Preston explicitly admitted that Victoria had never embezzled anything. Sophie, you could get in trouble for this. Her daughter looked at her with eyes that were suddenly much older than 16. He made Emma turn against you. He made everyone think you're crazy. Someone had to do something. Victoria pulled her daughter close. I'm going to fix this, she whispered. I promise. Sophie nodded against her shoulder. I know you will. The final custody hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning on Friday. Victoria arrived at the courthouse at 7:30. She wore the same gray cardigan she had worn to every previous hearing. She had no money for new clothes, and at this point, it did not matter. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was trying to survive. Marcus met her in the lobby. His tie was actually straight for once, and his suit looked like it might have been pressed. "You ready for this?" he asked. "No," Victoria admitted, "but I don't have a choice." They walked into courtroom 4B together. The gallery was filling up with the same cast of characters from the previous hearings. Preston's business associates, his golf buddies. The people who had everything to gain from Victoria's destruction. But this time, there were a few new faces. Caroline Webb sat in the front row, her rolling briefcase beside her. Margot Price sat next to her, looking nervous but determined. Denise was there too, having taken the day off work. Victoria looked at these women, her allies, her army. It was not much, but it was hers. Judge Thornton entered, and the courtroom rose. This is the final custody hearing in the matter of Marshall versus Marshall. The judge's voice was flat, businesslike. "Mr. Steele, you may proceed with your closing arguments." Donovan Steele stood. He buttoned his jacket and walked to the center of the room with the confidence of a man who had already won. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Victoria Marshall is financially deceptive, emotionally unstable, and has been systematically planning to deprive her husband of his rightful assets. She withdrew $15,000 without his knowledge. She has hidden accounts in her name. Her own daughter has testified to her erratic behavior." He paused for effect. "We ask that full custody be granted to Preston Marshall, and that Victoria Marshall be required to vacate the family home immediately." The courtroom was silent. Judge Thornton turned to the defense table. "Mr. Webb, your response?" Marcus stood. For a moment, he looked like the same defeated lawyer who had told Victoria he had not won a case in 3 years. Then he squared his shoulders. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce new evidence." Donovan shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Discovery has closed. They can't just—" "I'll allow it." Judge Thornton's voice was sharp. "Mr. Webb, proceed." Marcus walked to the front of the courtroom. His hands were steady. His voice was clear. "Your Honor, opposing counsel has painted a picture of Mrs. Marshall as a gold digger who contributed nothing to this marriage. But I have here IRS documents, certified and verified, showing that Victoria Marshall is listed as the 51% majority owner of Marshall Logistics, dating back to 2009. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Preston's face went pale. "Your Honor," Donovan's voice was strained. "That company has been dissolved. It was dissolved exactly 11 days ago." Marcus pulled out another document. 3 days after Mr. Marshall filed for divorce. Under Ohio law, that's called fraudulent conveyance, and it's a federal offense. "Your Honor, I object." Donovan was on his feet. "This evidence was obtained." Marcus continued, his voice rising. "We also have emails between Mr. Marshall and his attorneys, explicitly discussing how to hide assets from his wife. We have calendar entries showing meetings with offshore accountants, and we have video evidence of Mr. Marshall openly mocking his wife's trust in him." Donovan's face was red. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." Judge Thornton held up her hand. "Mr. Steele, sit down. Mr. Webb, continue." Marcus approached the bench. "Your Honor, Mrs. Marshall has been accused of embezzlement, but the evidence shows that those accounts were created without her knowledge, using forged signatures. We have forensic handwriting analysis to prove it." He presented document after document, the timeline of asset transfers, the evidence of fraud, the recordings Sophie had made. Finally, Marcus stepped back. "Your Honor, Preston Marshall didn't just betray his wife. He orchestrated a systematic campaign to destroy her. He bought witnesses. He manipulated his own daughter. He fabricated evidence. And he did it all while laughing about how easy it was. The courtroom was silent. Then a voice spoke from the gallery. It's true. Everyone turned. Brittany Cole was standing, her face pale but determined. Everything they're saying. It's true. Preston told me himself. He bragged about it. Preston grabbed her arm. Brittany, what are you doing? She pulled away from him. I thought I knew who you were. I thought we were in love. But last week, I found messages on your phone with another woman, a 24-year-old intern. Brittany looked at Victoria. For a moment, their eyes met. Two women, both deceived by the same man, seeing each other clearly for the first time. I'm sorry, Brittany said. I didn't know. I believed him when he said you were crazy. Victoria nodded slowly. She understood. She had believed Preston too, once. Judge Thornton removed her glasses. She rubbed her eyes. When she spoke, her voice was different. Not the cold, businesslike tone from before. Something more human. I've been on this bench for 25 years. I've seen husbands hide assets in their mothers' names. I've seen wives claim abuse to gain leverage. I've seen every trick in the book. She looked at Preston. But this is exceptional contempt for this court. Your Honor. Preston started to stand. This is absurd. Sit down. You can't just... I said sit down. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Thornton's voice could have cut glass. Mr. Marshall? Based on the evidence presented today, I am ordering an immediate forensic audit of all your financial holdings. Any assets transferred in the last 90 days will be frozen pending investigation. She paused. Furthermore, I am granting temporary full custody of the minor children to Mrs. Marshall, effective immediately. Victoria felt the words wash over her like a wave. Custody. Her daughters. She was going to see her daughters. And finally, Judge Thornton's voice was ice. I am referring this case to the State Attorney General for investigation of fraud, perjury, and witness tampering. She banged her gavel. Court is adjourned. Victoria walked out of the courtroom in a daze. She had won. After everything Preston had done, after every lie he had told, and every witness he had bought, she had won. But victory felt hollow, without her daughters. She was standing in the hallway, trying to process what had just happened, when she heard a voice behind her. Mom? Emma stood at the end of the hallway. Her face was streaked with tears. She looked younger than she had put on the witness stand, more like the little girl Victoria remembered. Mom, I'm so sorry, Emma's voice cracked. He told me things. He made it sound like you were the problem. And I believed him because it was easier to believe him than to think my dad was a liar. Victoria opened her arms. Come here, baby. Emma ran to her. They held each other in the courthouse hallway while people streamed past, while lawyers gathered their briefcases, while the world continued to turn around them. You should hate me, Emma whispered. I could never hate you. Ever. Victoria pulled back and looked at her daughter. You were manipulated by someone who was supposed to protect you. That's not your fault. None of this was your fault. Sophie appeared from somewhere, and then they were all three together, mother and daughters. A family that had been broken and was slowly, painfully beginning to heal. Marcus found them a few minutes later. His tie was askew again, and he had coffee on his shirt, and he was smiling. The judge granted emergency custody, he said. You can take the girls home tonight. Home. Victoria realized she did not know where home was anymore. Denise appeared at her elbow. You're staying with me, all three of you, for as long as you need. Victoria looked at her sister. At Marcus, who had fought for her, even when he thought he would lose. At Caroline, who had given them the tools to win. At Margot, who had risked everything to provide the evidence. She looked at her daughters, who were holding on to her like they were afraid she might disappear. Thank you, Victoria said to all of them. Thank you for believing me. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings and emotional healing. Preston was arrested 2 weeks after the custody hearing. The charges included fraud, witness tampering, and perjury. His bail was set at $2 million, which he could not post because all of his assets had been frozen. Victoria watched the news report of his arrest from Denise's living room. Preston was led out of his office in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief. He had been so certain he would win, so confident that his money and his lawyers would protect him. He had never imagined that the woman he had dismissed as worthless would be his downfall. "How do you feel?" Denise asked, handing her a cup of tea. Victoria considered the question. "I thought I would feel triumphant, or vindicated, but mostly I just feel tired." "That's normal," Denise said. "You've been fighting for your life for months. It's going to take time to recover." The girls adjusted slowly to their new reality. Emma was in therapy, working through the guilt of having testified against her mother. Sophie was doing better, her anxiety eased by the stability of knowing she was safe. One evening, Emma came to Victoria with a question. "Mom, why didn't you tell the court about Sophie's treatment? About why you took that money?" Victoria looked at her daughter. "Because some things are more important than winning. Sophie's privacy was more important. Protecting her was more important. But you could have lost everything." "I know." Victoria pulled Emma close. "But being a mother means making hard choices. It means putting your children first, even when it hurt." Emma was quiet for a long moment. "I want to be like you when I grow up," she finally said. Victoria felt tears sting her eyes. "You already are, baby. You already are." 6 months later, Victoria stood in front of a modest office building in downtown Columbus. A small sign on the door read, "Marshall and Associates Family Financial Consulting." It was not much. A 2-room office with second-hand furniture and a computer that was slightly out of date. But it was hers. Victoria had taken everything she had learned during her divorce and turned it into a new career. She helped other women navigate the financial complexities of ending their marriages. She taught them to read the documents they were asked to sign. She showed them how to protect themselves from the kinds of manipulation Preston had used against her. Her first client was a woman named Sarah who reminded Victoria of herself. Quiet, trusting, completely unprepared for the man she had married. "I found these documents in my husband's desk," Sarah said, spreading papers across Victoria's desk. "I don't understand what they mean." Victoria looked at the documents. She recognized the patterns immediately. The shell companies, the hidden accounts, the careful architecture of financial betrayal. "It means he's hiding assets," Victoria said. "And now you know exactly where." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Can you help me?" Victoria smiled. "That's what I'm here for." Marcus Webb visited the office sometimes. He was still a public defender, still had not won a major case, but he carried himself differently now. The victory in Victoria's case had reminded him why he had become a lawyer in the first place. His mother, Caroline, had become Victoria's unofficial mentor. She stopped by the office regularly with advice, encouragement, and homemade cookies that she insisted were good for brain function. "You know," Caroline said one afternoon, sitting across from Victoria's desk, "I worked in the legal system for 40 years. I saw a lot of injustice, a lot of people who got crushed by the system." She looked at Victoria with something like pride. "But I also saw something else. I saw that sometimes the truth wins. Sometimes the person everyone underestimated turns out to be the strongest one in the room." Victoria thought about everything she had been through: the betrayal, the humiliation, the moment in that courthouse bathroom when she had thought her life was over. "I didn't feel strong," she admitted. "I felt terrified." Caroline smiled. Courage isn't the absence of fear, sweetheart. Courage is being terrified and fighting anyway. The girls were doing well. Emma was a junior now, with plans to study law. She wanted to help families like hers, she said. She wanted to make sure other children never had to testify against their parents. Sophie was quieter about her plans, but she had started volunteering at a crisis hotline for teenagers. She understood, in a way most people did not, what it felt like to struggle in silence. Victoria watched her daughters grow into young women, and she felt something she had not felt in years. Pride, not in herself, but in them, in the people they were becoming. One evening, the three of them sat on Denise's back porch, watching the sunset. "Mom," Sophie asked, "do you ever regret it?" "Regret what?" "All of it. Marrying Dad, everything that happened." Victoria thought about the question for a long time. "I regret trusting someone who didn't deserve it. I regret not seeing the warning signs. I regret a lot of things." She looked at her daughters. "But I don't regret you. I don't regret the 16 years I spent raising you. I don't regret a single moment of being your mother." Emma reached over and took her hand. "We don't regret you either." They sat together as the sun went down. Three women who had survived something terrible. Three women who had found their way back to each other. It was not the life Victoria had imagined for herself. It was not the fairy tale ending she had once believed in, but it was real. It was hers, and it was enough. 1 year after the custody hearing, Victoria received a summons to testify in Preston's criminal trial. The federal courthouse was larger than the county court where her divorce had been decided. Higher ceilings, more marble, the weight of history pressing down on everyone who entered. Victoria wore a simple navy suit, nothing flashy, nothing to prove. She had spent the past year rebuilding her life. Her business was growing. Her daughters were thriving. She had even started dating again, tentatively, carefully, allowing herself to believe that not all men were like Preston. But standing in this courthouse, preparing to face him one more time, all of those accomplishments felt fragile. "Mrs. Marshall?" A court officer appeared at her elbow. "They're ready for you." Victoria walked into the courtroom. The gallery was packed with reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers. Preston's financial crimes had become a minor sensation, a cautionary tale about the dangers of marrying a narcissist. Preston sat at the defendant's table. He was thinner than she remembered, and his expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. Prison had not been kind to him. Their eyes met across the courtroom. Preston's gaze was filled with hatred, but beneath the hatred, Victoria saw something else. Fear. The man who had once controlled every aspect of her life was afraid of her now. Good, she thought. He should be. The prosecutor was a woman named Margaret Sullivan, a veteran of white-collar crime cases who had prosecuted some of the biggest financial frauds in Ohio history. "Mrs. Marshall," Margaret began, "can you identify the man who orchestrated the financial fraud scheme that defrauded investors of over $12 million? Victoria looked at Preston. She remembered the man she had married, the charming, ambitious, young manager who had promised her the world, the father of her children, the man she had trusted with everything. That man was gone. Maybe he had never existed at all. "Yes," Victoria said clearly. "That's Preston Marshall, my ex-husband." The testimony lasted 3 hours. Victoria walked the jury through everything. The early years of the company, the K1 she had signed without reading, the systematic campaign to destroy her reputation and steal her assets. She remained calm throughout. She did not cry. She did not waver. She answered every question with the precision of the accountant she had once been. When it was over, Victoria stepped down from the witness stand and walked past Preston's table. He grabbed her arm. The guards moved toward him, but Victoria held up her hand. "You destroyed me," Preston whispered, his voice cracked and bitter. Victoria looked at him, at the man who had mocked her, who had called her stupid, who had laughed about how easy she was to fool. "No, Preston," she said, her voice calm and clear. "You destroyed yourself. I just had the receipts." She pulled her arm free and walked out of the courtroom. The verdict came 2 weeks later. Guilty on all counts. Preston was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Victoria did not attend the sentencing. She had better things to do. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Victoria was in her office, reviewing documents for a new client, when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made her answer. "Mrs. Marshall?" The voice was professional, polished. "My name is Rebecca Crawford. I represent a consortium of investors who were defrauded by your ex-husband's fake corporation." Victoria leaned back in her chair. "I'm sorry for what happened to them. They're not looking for sympathy." Rebecca's voice carried a hint of a smile. "They're looking for a consultant. Someone who understands how he operated, someone who can help them recover their assets from other similar schemes." Victoria was confused. "I'm just an accountant." "You're an accountant who brought down a multi-million-dollar fraud. You saw patterns nobody else could see. You found evidence everyone else missed. You didn't give up when any reasonable person would have." Rebecca paused. "We need people like you, Mrs. Marshall. The consortium is prepared to offer you a position. The starting salary is $2 million a year." Victoria nearly dropped the phone. "I don't understand. You have a gift for seeing through lies, for finding the truth hidden in the numbers. There are a lot of people out there who hide their crimes the way Preston did. A lot of victims who need someone to fight for them." Victoria thought about her little office, her modest client list, the women she helped one at a time. She thought about what she could do with the resources of a major investment consortium behind her, the frauds she could expose, the victims she could help. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Take all the time you need." Rebecca's voice was warm. "But Mrs. Marshall, the people who underestimate you are going to keep making that mistake. Don't let that stop you from becoming who you're meant to be." Victoria walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight. It was the same courthouse where, 2 years ago, she had sat in a bathroom stall crying, certain that her life was over. She paused on the steps and looked up at the sky. The air was cool, the sun was warm, and somewhere in the distance, birds were singing. Her phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "How did it go?" "Sophie and I made dinner. It's probably terrible. Come home?" Victoria smiled. Home. She knew where that was now. It was not a building or an address. It was the people who loved her, the daughters who believed in her, the life she had built from the ashes of the one Preston had tried to destroy. She started walking. People ask me if I hate him. The thought came unbidden, a reflection on everything she had been through, if the revenge was worth it. But here's the thing. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for the truth. I was looking for my daughters. I was looking for myself. She passed a woman sitting alone on a bench outside the courthouse. The woman was crying quietly, clutching a manila envelope that probably contained divorce papers. Victoria hesitated. Then she sat down beside her. "Are you okay?" The woman looked up, startled. No, I'm not. My husband, he took everything. The house, the bumtium, the money. He's trying to take my kids." Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. Her name, her number. Marshall and Associates. "Call me tomorrow," she said. "I can help." The woman looked at the card, then at Victoria. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Victoria smiled. "Because someone helped me once, when I had nothing, and I promised myself that if I ever got the chance, I would do the same for someone else. The woman's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Thank you so much. Victoria stood up. Call me. We'll figure this out together. She continued walking, leaving the woman on the bench with a small spark of hope. That's how it works, she thought. One person helps another. One act of kindness creates another. The chain continues, unbroken, until somehow, impossibly, the world becomes a little bit better. Victoria's phone buzzed again. Another text from Emma. Seriously, the pasta might be burnt. Please come home before Sophie tries to fix it. Victoria laughed out loud. She typed back, On my way. Save me a plate. She walked through the city streets, past the office buildings and coffee shops, and ordinary people living ordinary lives. She thought about everything she had lost, her marriage, her home, her faith in the man she had loved. But she also thought about everything she had gained, her freedom, her purpose, her daughters, who had grown into extraordinary young women, the knowledge that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. They mocked the ex-wife in court. The words echoed in her mind, but they no longer carried any sting. They said she was nothing. They said she would lose everything. She smiled. And you know what? They were right about one thing. I did lose everything. The lies I believed, the man I thought I married, the life I thought I wanted. Victoria stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. But here's what they didn't understand. When you lose everything, you finally get to choose what you keep. The light changed. Victoria crossed the street. So, to every woman sitting alone right now, wondering if she can survive this, you can. Not because you're strong, not because you're special, but because strength is what happens when you have no other choice. And the people who underestimate you, they're about to find out what happens when they mock a woman with nothing left to lose. Victoria arrived at Denise's house just as the sun was setting. She could see through the window that the kitchen was full of smoke. Emma was waving a dish towel at the smoke detector, while Sophie was scraping something black out of a pot. Denise was laughing so hard she had to lean against the counter. Victoria opened the door and stepped inside. What happened? She asked, though she was already laughing. Emma and Sophie both turned to her with the identical expressions of sheepish guilt. We tried to make Mom's pasta recipe, Sophie said. It didn't go well. The pasta is definitely ruined, Emma added, but the garlic bread is... Actually, the garlic bread might also be ruined. Victoria looked at her daughters, at her sister, at the small, chaotic, imperfect family she had built. She thought about Rebecca Crawford's offer, $2 million a year, the chance to fight fraud on a national scale, a position that would make her one of the most powerful financial consultants in the country. She had not decided yet. There were pros and cons to consider, implications for her family, questions about what she really wanted from her life. But that was a decision for tomorrow. Tonight, she was going to order pizza with her daughters. She was going to laugh at the ruined pasta and the burnt garlic bread. She was going to be present in this moment, with these people, in this life that she had fought so hard to save. I love you guys, Victoria said. The girls looked at her, surprised by the sudden sentiment. We love you too, Mom, Emma said. Even though we ruined dinner, Sophie asked. Especially because you ruined dinner. They ordered pizza. They sat around the kitchen table and talked about school and work and dreams for the future. Emma shared her plans for law school. Sophie talked about a girl she had met at the crisis hotline who had become a close friend. Denise told embarrassing stories about Victoria as a teenager, and the girls laughed until they cried. It was ordinary. It was unremarkable. It was everything Victoria had ever wanted. Later that night, after the pizza was eaten and the girls had gone to bed, Victoria sat alone on the back porch. The stars were out, bright and infinite against the dark sky. She thought about Preston. Alone in a prison cell, she thought about Brittany, who had disappeared somewhere out west. She thought about Karen, her former best friend, who had sent an apology letter that Victoria had not yet decided how to answer. She thought about the woman on the bench outside the courthouse, the one who had reminded her so much of herself. That woman would call tomorrow. Victoria would help her, and maybe, someday, that woman would help someone else. The chain would continue. Victoria looked up at the stars. "Thank you," she whispered to no one in particular, to everyone who had helped her, to the universe that had given her a second chance. Then she stood up, walked inside, and went to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to rebuild and grow. But tonight, Victoria Marshall slept peacefully, surrounded by the people who loved her in a life that was entirely her own. And in her dreams, she was not the woman who had been mocked in court. She was the woman who had risen from the ashes. She was the woman who had found her truth. She was free. Now, if you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever wondered whether justice exists for people like us, then you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of survivors. We share stories like this every week. Stories of women who refuse to be silenced. Stories of karma served cold. Stories that remind us we are stronger than we know. Drop a comment below and tell me. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever had someone laugh at you only to watch you succeed? I read every single comment, and your stories inspire the content we create. Share this video with a friend who needs to hear it today. Sometimes, one story can change everything. And if this message resonates with you, hit the like button. It helps more women find these stories when they need them most. Now let us begin. Closing disclaimer. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and authentic emotional value to our audience. Every story we share is crafted with intention, designed not just to entertain, but to empower, validate, and inspire the women who watch. Thank you for being part of this community. Your support makes this work possible.